Welcome to War Bios, the podcast where we delve into the most pivotal battles in history, and I'm your host, General Biography. Today, we're going to explore one of the most crucial conflicts of the American Civil War, the Battle of Atlanta, a series of battles that took place in the summer of 1864. This campaign was a turning point in the war, as Union forces under the command of Major General William Tecumseh Sherman clashed with the Confederate Army of Tennessee, led by General John Bell Hood, in a fight for control of the strategic city of Atlanta. By the summer of 1864, the Civil War had been raging for 3 years, with both the Union and Confederacy suffering heavy losses. The Confederacy, in particular, was facing significant challenges, including a dwindling economy, shrinking territory, and a severe shortage of manpower. Despite these challenges, the Confederacy remained determined to defend its territory, and Atlanta, with its strategic location and extensive railroad network, was a crucial prize. The city was a vital transportation hub, connecting the Confederacy's eastern and western theaters, and its capture would give the Union a significant advantage in terms of logistics and supply chains. As we delve into the Battle of Atlanta, it's essential to understand the complexities of the conflict and the personalities involved. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, the Union commander, was a seasoned veteran with a reputation for strategic brilliance and tactical innovation. He had spent years studying the art of war, and his experiences in the Mexican-American War and the early battles of the Civil War had honed his skills as a commander. Sherman's army, comprising over 100,000 soldiers, was a well-oiled machine with a strong emphasis on discipline, training, and logistics. On the other side, General John Bell Hood, the Confederate commander, was a skilled tactician with a reputation for bravery and aggression. He had taken command of the Army of Tennessee in July 1864, replacing General Joseph E. Conn. Johnston, who had been relieved by Confederate President Jefferson Davis due to his cautious approach to defending Atlanta. Hood's appointment marked a significant shift in Confederate strategy, as he was determined to take the fight to the Union Army and defend Atlanta at all costs. In May 1864, Union forces under Sherman began their advance into Georgia, with the goal of capturing Atlanta and splitting the Confederacy in two. The Confederate Army of Tennessee, then under the command of General Joseph E. Johnston, was tasked with defending the city. Johnston, a seasoned commander, adopted a defensive strategy, using the rugged terrain of northern Georgia to slow down the Union advance. He employed a series of delaying tactics, including skirmishes, raids, and rearguard actions, to buy time for his engineers to fortify the defenses around Atlanta. As Sherman's forces pushed deeper into Georgia, they encountered stiff resistance from Johnston's army. The Confederates used the terrain to their advantage, employing clever tactics such as ambushes, sniping, and sabotage to harass and slow down the Union advance. Meanwhile, Sherman's army was facing its own challenges, including treacherous terrain, sweltering heat, and a constant shortage of supplies. The Union soldiers had to contend with dusty roads, raging rivers, and treacherous mountain passes, all while maintaining a relentless pace to keep up with Sherman's aggressive strategy. In June 1864, the Union Army launched a series of attacks against the Confederate positions near Kennesaw Mountain, just northwest of Atlanta. Although these battles were fierce and bloody, they ultimately failed to dislodge the Confederates from their strongholds. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but the Confederates held firm, using their fortified positions to devastating effect. Despite these setbacks, Sherman remained determined to capture Atlanta, and he began to develop a new strategy, one that would involve outflanking the Confederate defenses and cutting off their supply lines. As Sherman's army continued its relentless push towards Atlanta, the Confederates found themselves facing an increasingly dire situation. On July 17, 1864, General John Bell Hood took command of the Army of Tennessee, replacing General Joseph E. Johnston, who had been relieved by Confederate President Jefferson Davis due to his cautious approach to defending Atlanta. The change in leadership marked a significant shift in Confederate strategy, as Hood was determined to take the fight to the Union Army and defend Atlanta at all costs. This decision would prove to be a double-edged sword, as it would lead to some of the most intense fighting of the war, but ultimately it would also seal the fate of the city. As Hood's army prepared for battle, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The men were exhausted, hungry, and desperate, but they were also determined to defend their homes and their way of life. The streets of Atlanta were filled with the sounds of drums beating, horses neighing, and soldiers shouting as the Confederates mobilized for what would be a series of brutal and bloody battles. On July 20, 1864, Hood's army launched a fierce assault against the Union positions near Peachtree Creek, just north of Atlanta. The battle was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but ultimately the Confederates were repelled, suffering over 2,500 losses. The fighting was chaotic and disorganized, with soldiers on both sides struggling to maintain their formations amidst the smoke, noise, and chaos of the battlefield. The Union lines held firm, however, and the Confederates were forced to retreat back towards Atlanta. Despite this setback, Hood remained determined to defend the city, and he launched another attack on July 22, 1864, at the Battle of Atlanta. This battle was marked by some of the most intense fighting of the war, with both sides trading artillery fire and infantry charges. The Confederates made several attempts to break through the Union lines, but each time they were repelled, suffering heavy losses. As the battle raged on, Sherman's army began to gain the upper hand, slowly but surely pushing the Confederates back towards Atlanta. On July 28, 1864, Hood launched a final desperate attack against the Union positions at Ezra Church, just west of Atlanta. The battle was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but ultimately, the Confederates were defeated, suffering over 3,000 losses. The city was now on the brink of collapse, and the inhabitants were forced to flee or face occupation by the Union Army. As the month of July drew to a close, the Confederates found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. Atlanta was on the verge of falling, and Hood's army was exhausted and depleted. Despite this, Hood remained determined to defend the city, and he began to prepare for a final showdown with Sherman's army. The men were tired, hungry, and demoralized, but they refused to give up, knowing that the fate of their city and their nation hung in the balance. In early August 1864, Sherman's army launched a series of attacks against the Confederate positions around Atlanta, hoping to finally capture the city. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but slowly but surely, the Union Army began to gain the upper hand. On August 6, 1864, the Confederates launched a final desperate attack against the Union positions at Utoy Creek, just southwest of Atlanta. The battle was fierce, but ultimately, the Confederates were defeated, suffering over 1,000 losses. As the Confederates retreated back towards Atlanta, Sherman's army began to close in on the city. On August 31, 1864, the Union Army launched a final assault against the Confederate positions around Jonesboro, just south of Atlanta. The battle was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, but ultimately, the Confederates were defeated, and Atlanta fell to the Union Army. In the aftermath of the battle, Sherman's army occupied Atlanta, marking a major turning point in the war. As one Union soldier wrote, "The fall of Atlanta is a blow from which the Confederacy will never recover." The city was left in ruins, with many buildings destroyed or damaged, and its inhabitants were forced to flee or face occupation by the Union Army. The once thriving metropolis was now a mere shadow of its former self, with its economy in shambles and its infrastructure destroyed. As Hood's army retreated from Atlanta, they left behind a city that was on the brink of collapse. The fall of Atlanta marked the beginning of the end of the Confederacy, and it would have far-reaching consequences for the war and the nation as a whole. In the words of Sherman himself, "Atlanta is a city that has been doomed to destruction, and I am the instrument of its doom." As the Union Army occupied the city, they began to implement their own brand of governance, imposing strict rules and regulations on the inhabitants. As the Union Army occupied Atlanta, the once thriving metropolis was transformed into a mere shadow of its former self. The city's economy lay in shambles, its infrastructure destroyed, and its people struggled to come to terms with the harsh realities of war. The fall of Atlanta marked a significant turning point in the conflict, as it deprived the Confederacy of a crucial transportation hub and industrial center. As the Union Army imposed its own brand of governance on the city, strict rules and regulations were put in place to maintain order. Martial law was declared, and a curfew was enforced to prevent any potential uprisings or acts of sabotage. The inhabitants of Atlanta, many of whom had already suffered greatly during the siege, were forced to adapt to their new circumstances. Some attempted to flee, while others remained, determined to rebuild and restore their city to its former glory. In the months that followed, Sherman's army continued to push deeper into Confederate territory, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The March to the Sea, as it came to be known, was a campaign of scorched earth tactics designed to break the will of the Confederate people and destroy their ability to wage war. The city's factories, warehouses, and railroads lay in ruins, its buildings reduced to rubble, and its streets littered with the debris of conflict. As the Union Army marched through Georgia, they encountered numerous challenges, from treacherous terrain to fierce resistance from Confederate forces. However, Sherman's strategic vision and tactical genius ultimately proved decisive, as his army successfully navigated these obstacles and continued their relentless push into the heart of the Confederacy. The March to the Sea was a masterclass in operational art, as Sherman skillfully exploited the weaknesses of the Confederate defenses, using his superior numbers and mobility to outmaneuver and overwhelm his opponents. The human cost of war was starkly evident during this period, as civilians and soldiers alike suffered greatly. The city of Atlanta, once a thriving metropolis, was now a mere shadow of its former self, its people struggling to survive in the midst of war. The streets were filled with the sounds of gunfire, the smell of smoke and ash hung in the air, and the cries of the wounded and the dying echoed through the ruins. The war had become a brutal and merciless struggle, with no quarter asked or given. As the war drew to a close, the Battle of Atlanta was remembered as a pivotal moment in the conflict. It marked a turning point in the war, after which the Confederacy never fully recovered. As one historian noted, the fall of Atlanta was a death blow to the Confederacy, a blow from which they never recovered. The city's capture had dealt a crippling blow to the Confederate war effort, depriving them of a vital industrial and transportation hub. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.